and I'll call this meeting to order. Welcome to the meeting number 12, the House Commons Standing Committee of Government Operations and Estimates. The committee is meeting today from 2:37 my time, which would be 3:37 Eastern time, till 5:37 p.m. We will hear from witnesses as part of the committee's meeting study on new tech security equipment contract, and then discuss committee business in camera at the end of the meeting. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Interpretation in this video conference will work very much like in a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen to either use the floor, English, or French, and we would ask you to use the language that you will be speaking. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. To raise a point of order during the meeting, committee members should ensure their microphone is unmuted and say point of order and get the chair's attention. In order to ensure social distancing in the committee room, if you need to speak privately with the clerk or analyst during the meeting, please email them through the committee email address. For those people who are participating in the committee room, please note that masks are required unless seated and when physically distancing is not possible. So we were about to start. We are going to have 5 minutes from our witnesses to speak, and we will go just in order. I'll call your name out. And President, I understand, Mr. Alcock, you aren't going to be giving a presentation. So we will start. First off, I'll invite Mr. Charles Burton to make his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon. I would like to supplement the evidence this committee heard from the civil servants on November 18th by providing information about the relationship between NUCTEC and the Chinese Communist Party apparatus that is the regime of the People's Republic of China. If you look at the NUCTEC corporate organogram, it shows the Chinese Communist Party branch and its party secretary, Chen Zhongnian, at the apex of the NUCTEC corporate pyramid. The party branch is at the top. The NUCTEC board of directors and senior executive management is therefore subordinate to direction from the Chinese Communist Party. Indeed, Party Secretary Chen is also the chairman of NUCTEC's board of directors. As a very senior official of the Chinese Communist Party, Mr. Chen is also currently a member of China's National People's Congress. So the party secretary is the highest ranked and most powerful official at NUCTEC. The Chinese state heavily subsidizes NUCTEC and other Chinese hardware and software development and production to make it highly competitive in global markets. That's why they rendered the cheapest bid to us. But like all Chinese state enterprises, NUCTEC's raison d'etre is not primarily economic profitability, but also to serve other overall PRC regime purposes. Now, as mentioned in the evidence in your previous meeting, China's National Intelligence Law of 2017 compels all Chinese nationals, including those working for NUCTEC at home and abroad, to collaborate with agents of the Chinese state on request to further Chinese state interests by purloining confidential data and engaging in compromise of infrastructure around the world. But this intelligence law is really just a pro forma. In fact, NUCTEC's connection to the Chinese party military state is much more than a master-servant relationship. It's really a symbiotic relationship. And what I mean by that is that NUCTEC, like all Chinese state enterprises, is fully integrated into the PRC party, state, military, and security apparatus because, as Party General Secretary Xi Jinping has put it, party, government, military, civilian, and academic, east, west, south, north, and center, the party leads everything. And so just as the Chinese Communist Party does not allow for true civil society or non-government sectors, there's also no industrial enterprises in China existing independently from China's party state. So in terms of assessing bids, we have to understand that NUCTEC is of an utterly different substantive nature than its foreign competitors, the foreign competitors existing in a civil space outside of political institutions. So this is a hugely significant distinction between NUCTEC and non-Chinese security equipment concerns. NUCTEC's purposes are actually the Chinese Communist Party's purposes for NUCTEC because of its role as an integral element of the unified Communist Party regime. NUCTEC's primary purpose is not to generate profits, but to serve the overall interests of the Chinese Communist Party at home and abroad, including China's massive domestic and international intelligence gathering program. NUCTEC can reciprocally draw on Chinese military and intelligence services to obtain foreign technologies and foreign data to serve its advantage. And it's fully supported by the Chinese Communist Party's extensive United Front Work Department operations coordinated out of the PRC's embassies and consulates abroad. So this is because NUCTEC, like all PRC enterprises, is mobilized by the Chinese Communist Party to serve PRC regime geostrategic goals throughout the world. And that's why you have the Chinese Communist Branch Party Secretary Chen Zhongnian as the highest ranked official of NUCTEC. So the key here is to recognize that NUCTEC is a function of an integrated party, state, military, civilian, market, PRC regime complex whose strategic intent is severely at odds to the interests and values of the liberal democratic West, including Canada. So my conclusion, very brief. Canada's country-agnostic approach to procurement, while arguably politically correct, should not be applied to bids from People's Republic of China enterprises, state or otherwise. Because China routinely, grossly flouts the norms of the international rules-based order in diplomacy and trade, this country-agnostic approach obscures the realities of Chinese regime enterprises and the threat they pose to Canada's national security. In short, like the Chinese Communist Party, NUCTEC cannot be trusted by Canada under any circumstances. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. And now I'll go to Mr. Luprecht for 5 minutes, please. I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong.
Oh, pas de souci. Mesdames et messieurs, merci de la...
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation. Please feel free to ask your questions in either official language.
Submission that hopefully you have received. I shall have to abstract from that submission. I co-authored that submission intentionally with my colleague David Skillicorn from the School of Computing in order to lend greater heft to the actual security assessment of the technology. So we have long argued that Canada's strategic and policy engagement needs to be far more nuanced to reflect the complexity of a relationship that is evolving rapidly. On some matters, China is a partner, on some a competitor, and on some an adversary. These three challenges converge on matters of technology, security, and procurement. Our assessment of the security risks is that on the technical side, they are moderate and manageable, although there are risks. So the broader issue at stake is from a democratic government or procurement perspective of procuring such technology from China, in particular from state-owned enterprises. First, as Professor Burton has already pointed out, China is playing the long game and is engaging in predatory market practices in order to undercut other companies. You can find this well documented in a report released last month by the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations that goes into substantial detail on NUCTEC and other Chinese technology companies and how exactly this works. So in principle, SOEs or partial SOEs from non-democratic regimes should be excluded from Canadian public tendering processes because they're not competing on a level playing field. In other words, this matter of NUCTEC should be referred to Canadian competition authorities. And in lieu of that referral, I suppose we're here today having these meetings. In case there's any doubt about just how arm's length NUCTEC is, it was founded in 1997 by the son of former Chinese leader Hu Jintao, which makes him part of the notorious princelings and the Red Royalty that are widely despised across China. So doing business with NUCTEC is bad for Canada's image, bad for China, and bad for Chinese and our image with the average Chinese. Second, Canadian companies are precluded from competing for public procurement tenders in China. And so the principle of reciprocity suggests that companies that are either explicitly excluded from foreign tenders or that structure their markets so that foreign companies cannot compete should not be able to compete for federal public tenders in Canada. Third, Canada should not be doing government procurement business with a country that engages in hostage diplomacy, bullies Canada and some of its closest allies, spreads blatant false information, engages in large-scale and systematic foreign influence, regularly flouts international law, including endangering allied warships, and is responsible for large-scale human rights abuses on a scale not seen for decades. NUCTEC is complicitous in this regard because its relations and selling equipment to the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau goes back for well over a decade, as recently testified on July 20th before the Subcommittee on International Human Rights and Subcommittee of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. So Canada shouldn't be duplicitous in terms of doing business with a company and then on the other side that engages in large-scale human rights abuses and then at the same time criticizing China for how it treats individuals of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. Fourth, the 21st century is really about data and technology, and China is doing both to enable and promote digital authoritarianism and undermine democratic values and to actively compromise and interfere in sovereign decision-making. We are now witnessing this on a daily basis, and every successful public tender for Chinese technology in Canada is an accelerant towards this dystopian future. Ergo, Canada should be banning any Chinese state-owned enterprises, partial SOEs, or companies suspected of receiving undisclosed government subsidies, and all Chinese technology companies from Canadian federal public procurement, including standing offers. In cases where that would be in breach of Canada's international trade or legal obligations, the decision should rest with the minister, who should make that decision public. Finally, and I conclude on this matter is indicative of broader issues that have long plagued the federal public procurement in this country, especially in matters of security and defense. I remind the committee of the U.S. Department of Commerce's annual report on most difficult countries for military procurement, so for U.S. companies in which to do procurement for U.S. military assets. Canada ranks second on that list of countries most difficult to do procurement in. That is robust outside validation of the dysfunction of procurement with which this committee should be seized. The government of Canada has an opportunity to learn and leverage the visibility from this near miss on NUCTEC, which manifests the extent to which the broad scale and threat risk of this bilateral relationship continually outstrips the government's current toolkit and governance capacity. This is an opportunity to realize that instead of fending off the alligator that's closest to the boat, the toolkit that enables these examples is simply not fit for purpose. However inchoate, we have tools to review investments against national security considerations, such as the ICA, and more are coming with respect to critical infrastructure. Yet there are no comparable tools in place or even under discussion for national security reviews of research and development partnerships, even for domains under the federal government's remit, such as the Tri-Council grant funding agencies, associated university research, and national labs. Such a built-for-purpose toolkit on procurement is long overdue.
Thank you, Mr. Lippert. Now we'll go to Mr. Mulrooney for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. And I'll, again, offer a few opening comments. On one level, what we're seeing with the NUTEC affair is a kind of disconnect that plagues bureaucracies. I was aware of the risk of disconnect when I served as ambassador to China. We had a dozen different organizations at the embassy, each working directly for managers in Canada. I used to say that my role as ambassador required me to be connector in chief. This was essential because failure to connect and to see the bigger picture almost always meant failure at the level of larger Canadian interests. And some very significant Canadian interests were at risk in the New Tech affair, and you've heard about some of them already. Briefly, it's not in Canada's interest to advance the global dominance of a Chinese state-owned technology powerhouse, or to create long-term access and partnerships in our system that could make us vulnerable in the future. Although bureaucratic disconnects happen in normal times, these are not normal times. I was the secretary to the independent panel on Canada's future role in Afghanistan, which was known as the Manley Panel. Canada's mission in Kandahar was failing because the Canadian Forces, Foreign Affairs, and CETA each saw the mission differently. The very wise people on the panel said that Afghanistan was a once-in-a-decade challenge, one that required new structures and new approaches. We needed a single vision, one that was owned and led by the Prime Minister. We needed to identify achievable objectives, to assign responsibilities clearly, to resource the challenge appropriately, and above all, to see the mission as a Canadian priority, one that transcended specific military, diplomatic, or aid objectives. The panel's focus on process was unorthodox. Ottawa is a town that is in love with policy ideas and about attempting something of national importance without mobilizing and organizing for success is irresponsible, a dereliction of duty to Canada and Canadians. Managing the Canadian implications of the rise of China isn't a once-in-a-decade challenge. It's closer to a once-in-a-century challenge, requiring a complete rethinking of foreign and domestic policies. So the New Tech case is more than a bureaucratic disconnect, more than a performance failure by a government that is more challenged than most when it comes to actually getting things done. The experience offers us a brief, worrying glimpse of the state of China competence in a government that has had vivid daily warnings of the extent to which China poses what the Deputy Minister of Global Affairs has referred to as a strategic challenge to Canada. But we've seen no signs of heightened awareness, no signs of increased urgency to identify and better manage anything and everything having to do with China, and no evidence of any effort to galvanize the entire government, all departments and agencies, in an effort of pressing national importance. This isn't actually a policy problem. It's a problem arising from the absence of policy. The officials you've already heard from were well-intentioned, but they didn't display any real sense of urgency or even much awareness of our China challenge. This isn't their fault. It points to a failure of leadership, a lack of that sense of priority and high-level accountability required to face up to and intelligently manage what may well be a once-in-a-century challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mulroney. Ms. Carvin, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I do note my computer has glitched throughout, so hopefully I will be able to make it through. I believe you have my written testimony. I would be happy to repeat if required. Thank you for having me here today. Before I begin, I feel I should disclose that I worked for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service between 2012 and 2015 as a strategic analyst. I did not, however, specifically work on this file, and my interest in the nature of Canada's relationship with China comes from my own scholarly interests, research, and activities. In this sense, I'm very pleased to be able to speak with the committee today about this important issue. My argument is essentially this. The nuke tech contract is problematic, but not for many of the reasons that have been discussed in the media. Yes, the scanners are made in China, but so are the computers our embassy use, and the phones, and basically all the telecommunications equipment, and all of those, basically all the technologies that are made elsewhere, they probably contain components that are in fact made in China. For better and quite possibly worse, it is not possible at this time to have technology that is not made in China or with parts that are somehow made in China or sourced from China. Now, of course, there is a risk here, but at the same time, it's not clear that banning all of this technology is going to make us safe either. Indeed, it's more problematic to suggest that bans on equipment make us safer. By this, I mean China is good at getting the information it wants through a variety of means. And many, if not most, non-Chinese technology firms, particularly in the telecommunication sectors, have security flaws and vulnerabilities that can be and most certainly are exploited by malicious actors. Frankly, there are many ways to spy on Canadian embassies abroad: physical surveillance, phishing attacks, insider threats, and exploiting vulnerabilities in software. An X-ray machine in a non-classified area seems to me one of the clumsier way of trying to do it. In this sense, I feel the technical threat element has been overstated in the public discourse. Now, I want to be clear, this does not mean the nuke tech contract is fine. There are clear problems with it and the procurement process, which this entire matter illustrates. The first issue is that of state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. I don't think I need to explain to the committee why these are a problem generally. But in this particular case, it is worth noting that these are firms that can normally depend on extremely generous support from the state in terms of money or strategic information often gathered through corporate espionage. These advantages give SOEs the ability to undermine any competition. Because they do not have to adhere to the normal business practices, they can bid on contracts at very low prices in order to win without having to worry about profit or to answering to shareholders. In the long term, this can lead to moves that effectively skew the market in certain strategic areas. In this sense, it is clear that some SOEs represent a geoeconomic challenge to Canada and Western technology firms in their ability to engage in anti-competitive practices. This behavior should not be rewarded by the federal government. This relates to a second concern about Canada's procurement practices. It is worth noting that Canada is increasingly developing processes around foreign investment by SOEs generally, and has recently tightened restrictions around certain sectors such as healthcare during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, for some reason, it appears that protective measures around foreign investment do not extend to the federal procurement process. Based on the testimony provided to this committee on November 18th, 2020 by Mr. Scott Harris, Vice President, Intelligence and Enforcement Branch of the Canada Border Services Agency, his organization, quote, colleagues at CSE and elsewhere to gather their expertise, end quote, on the issue of security threats from nuke tech technology. If this consultative step was taken in the case of CBSA, why is this not standard practice across the federal government? The lack of standardized policies and procedures, where some departments seek security advice and others do not, seems to be a serious problem. In conclusion, my recommendations are as follows. Canada should have a policy in place where the procurement of goods and services provided by SOEs by any department are given additional, formalized, and consistent scrutiny to make sure such investments align with Canadian priorities and values. To be sure, all SOEs are different, and some are simply profit motivated. In this sense, a total ban does not make sense. However, it is something to be risk managed in cooperation with Canada's security agencies. Second, the federal government needs to develop what is often referred to as a defense in-depth policy when it comes to the procurement and use of technology, particularly as so much of it presently comes from China. This is a layered security approach where multiple steps that emphasize measures that control physical access, technology controls that limit what adversaries can do should they get access to a system, and fundamentally for the issue before us, administrative measures that ensure the right policies are in place to prevent security breaches. Bans will likely not solve our problems, but risk management with layered security approaches will likely be more successful in the long run. Of course, implementing such a policy will be difficult. In our federal system, many different agencies have a different slice of the security and procurement pie. CSE is responsible for the technological assessment, CSIS, the geoeconomic threat context, PPSC, ensuring the best value for money, etc. Media reporting has indicated that tensions have emerged in similar exercises by federal departments, such as the investment reviews required by the Investment Canada Act. However, our federal departments and agencies continue to work together on these new security challenges, and they are learning to get along for the greater good. There is no reason why this could not happen in the area of securing procurement for the federal government. Thank you.
Thank you all for your presentation. It's greatly appreciated. We are now going to go into our questioning.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
I can't hear him either.
I don't know, Dr. Kitchen, if you can hear me or not. We're not hearing you in the room. I don't know if you can hear me. If you could give me a thumbs up, please. Hold on, we're just going to check with our technicians. We are not hearing you in the room. One moment, please, Mr. Chair.
Kelly, can you hear him? I thought they were blocking liberal. When are we doing our coffee? When are we doing our coffee?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. I wonder if you could try again. We're going to check, see if we can hear you in the room, please.
Certainly. I'll scream a little louder from Saskatchewan so that everyone can hear me.
Well, you must be screaming loud now. We are hearing you now, so that is good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and my apologies, and you may continue.
Thank you. Just thank you, everybody. Apologize, and please bear with us while we deal with the technology. But we will go into the questions, and as I've indicated, we will go the first hour as we normally do, and then the second hour will, in order to conform to time, we will go 3 minutes for the Bloc, and then 3 minutes for the NDP, and then 5 minutes for the Conservatives, and then 5 minutes for the Liberals to finish off. So we will start off with the first round with Mr. Paul Hughes. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à vous tous pour... J'écoutais, c'est assez...
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. It confirms many things that we at the Conservative Party already think. We're quite worried about what's going on with China. And as you said, Mr. Mulroney, it poses many problems. I have a question for Mr. Burton. You talked about the relationship between NUCTEC and the Chinese Communist Party and links with the Chinese army as well. I'd like to know what the threat is. What is the direct threat in terms of Canada's national security?
Well, I think...
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je pense ce dont il s'agit finalement, c'est que le gouvernement chinois a une politique.
Yeah, I'm getting the French interpretation through my headset.
Could you try again, Mr. Burton? Mr. Burton, are you sure you've selected the English channel for when speaking English?
Yes, it definitely says English there on my screen.
All right. If you could continue and we'll try again, please. Thank you.
Okay. With regard to the question of the security threat, I think that there is no question in my mind that the Chinese government seeks capabilities that may be usable if intent comes later. So, capability plus intent is a threat. And I think in terms of the installation of these very reasonably priced X-ray systems and so on, aside from, the concern that CSE raised the last time about USB ports or hard drives inside, or, there's also just the idea that people who are possibly agents of the Chinese regime would have the opportunity to spend a lot of time in embassy premises at the door, potentially interfering with the equipment or installing phone chips and that kind of thing. I just think that in general, the Chinese regime would see an opportunity in having the ability to access the embassy. I have heard of a of a Chinese installed streetcar system in Britain, where the company found out to their surprise that, in fact, on the basis that they needed to service it, that the streetcar system was connected to China via a telephone link, which would allow people in the city of Nanjing to stop and start those streetcars remotely. So I think that they want that kind of capability, not necessarily that they have the intent to use it immediately, but that there is the potential to make use of this as an opportunity for the Chinese state to realize its geostrategic purposes in future. And if I could say one other thing, as someone that spent a lot of time in China, I was educated in China. If I went to an embassy and saw that I was being scanned by a Chinese manufactured machine, I would be quite reluctant to go in, just because of the potential of using sophisticated artificial intelligence and so on to monitor, as we've seen with this kind of equipment as it's used in places like Xinjiang against the Uyghurs. So, I just think in general we have to be very cautious about any firm which is connected to the Chinese state.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you. I get the feeling that everyone knows it. Some people don't dare react, perhaps for economic reasons. For example, the NUCTA systems in an embassy is one thing, but of course, practically everything is made in whole or in part in China. So, and we've let a lot of this equipment into our government systems. I mean, there's private ownership is something else, but I think we need to be very cautious when it comes to government procurement. And we heard from officials 2 weeks ago, and there seems to be no communication between different departments. We saw Deloitte to report that cost us $60,000 a page, I believe, and none of their solutions will resolve the problem. In your opinion, is there something that the government of Canada can do quickly to try and resolve this problem?
Is that
Mr. Burton?
Is that question addressed?
The question is addressed to Mr. Burton.
Yes, well, I agree absolutely with what Stephanie Carvin has said, that we need to get better procedures in, fully aware of the potential security risk of acquiring Chinese equipment at, they bid the lowest price, similar to, that the Chinese firm Huawei was underbidding Ericsson and Nokia to the order of something like 30%. I think we have to be aware that there is a security threat posed by companies of this nature, which, as I said in my opening statement, are of a completely different substantive character than other companies. I mean, if you look at the difference, a Canadian company like the BlackBerry company could not draw on the resources of CSE to get information about technology being produced by their competitors or to acquire data about bidding and so on, whereas Chinese state firms absolutely have the resources of the state at their disposal because it's an integrated, unified system. So I think from that point of view, awareness of this is the key, and proper procedures to ensure that that this never happens again would be terrific. And I also very much agree with Mr. Mulroney, which is our government has simply not put enough resources in getting the expertise necessary to fully understand the nature of our engagement with China, which opens up many, many issues that make it different from our engagement with really any other country in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. We now have Mr. Johari for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to also thank all the witnesses. This was quite informative presentation, which covered the spectrum of point of views and our relationship vis-a-vis China. But the one that inspired me or kind of raised my eyebrows were the comments made by Mr. Mulroney. I jotted a number of points down that I'd like to kind of get some point of view from Mr. Maroney. In summary, the way I took it was that there is an absence of policy vis-a-vis China or the broader relationship with China. You talked about centralized leadership. You talked about alignment across many of the various departments. You talk about mobilization or organization for the success and high level of accountability. But what stood out that says that you indicate that there is an absence of policy. Given the fact that you work in the embassy and represented Canada, can you share your point of view vis-a-vis Canadian government's policy toward China over the last 10 to 15 years? We know there's been a shift in their policies. Has our policies aligned itself with them, and specifically with regards to technology, investment, socioeconomic, foreign affairs policies? Can you shed some light on that one? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think the first thing to remember is that China is it's dynamic, and so it's changing. The China of Hu Jintao, which was becoming more aggressive and assertive, has been replaced by the China of Xi Jinping, which is extremely aggressive and assertive. And to that extent, no, we have not kept up with the changes. And a wise person in Australia once said that while Australia didn't have a China policy, China very definitely has an Australia policy, and it very definitely has a Canada policy. But let me just say two things about this issue. One, I don't think it's a procurement issue. I think the real issue is a China issue. And two, we shouldn't underestimate the challenge of galvanizing and bringing the government together. I'm not as optimistic as Professor Carvin in terms of the ability at the grassroots for people to come together. This takes real leadership. It requires everybody in government to take note and pause when China comes up anywhere and consult. It requires a much higher level, raising the bar when it comes to the security standards that we expect of China. This isn't just like buying a computer that may be made in China. This is a long-term relationship with a company, NewTek, that would be across the board for all of our embassies, where China could find the weakest link in that that chain of embassies. And by the way, they will find a weak link somewhere. So this is larger. And finally, this isn't just a Canadian problem. We have allies who are in exactly the same boat. This is where our diplomacy should be directed, to be sitting down with the Australians and the New Zealanders, with the Danes and the Swedes and the Brits, to talk about how they're dealing with this issue. And I think we would find that there's common cause. So we're a long way behind, but I have great faith in our ability to catch up, but it takes high-level will. Thank you.
Specifically to a bilateral investment treaty that we signed back in 2012 with China, the Foreign Investment Protection Act, or FIPA, allowing for non-discriminatory and equitable treatment of Chinese foreign investors. In general, do you think we should reconsider that? We should reevaluate it, or we should amend it? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the thing about the foreign investment agreement that we should remember is that it applies to existing foreign investments, and it's about equitable treatment of existing Chinese investments in Canada and Canadian investments in China. The government always retained the ability to block any investment in Canada that runs counter to any perception of Canadian interests and Canadian security interests in general. So I don't see that as central to this issue. We've always retained the ability, and in fact, we've shown the willingness to do that over time. So this isn't really an investment issue; it's a procurement issue, but it's part of a larger web of concerns about China's encroachment.
Thank you. So, in one hand, I hear it's not a technology issue; it's a procurement issue. On the other hand, I hear it's not really a procurement issue; it's a much bigger fundamental issue. So help me reconcile any of, probably we can go to Mr. Burton. I know your aspect was on the social, on the security aspect, but how would you reconcile the fact that this is not a procurement issue, or it's a procurement issue, this is not a technology issue, and it's a policy issue? Can you give us your insight into that?
Well, I think that certainly it is an issue of the process of procurement, in the sense that, as pointed out, the civil servants who spoke to you last time are good people who were, behaving in ways according to the regulations and practices as set down. But clearly, those regulations and practices are not effective in preventing the Chinese state from putting in a low bid with all 63 of those boxes ticked off, and potentially getting their equipment into the doors of embassies, allowing all sorts of possibilities for access by Chinese agents into our diplomatic facilities. So, I think that we need a general policy on understanding the nature of procurement from the Chinese state, and a very careful process of assessment of these bids by people who have the expertise to assess the security risk in the relevant government agencies. I think for the most part, we won't be getting any Chinese procurement.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. We will now go to Ms. Vignola for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Ma première question.
Thank you very much. My first question is addressed to Mr. Burton. Mr. Burton, I had the pleasure of reading some of your articles, including the one published in the Globe and Mail on December 4th, in which you talk about the situation between China and Australia, and the fact that, as a reprisal, China imposed huge taxes on Australia, for example, their barley, wine. It cost them billions of dollars. Here in Canada, we have some similar situations with Huawei and Nuktek that's got now has contracts going all the way to 2023, if my memory serves me. If we stop working in silos this way, what would be the economic consequences for Canada? I know there could be negative repercussions as well as positive repercussions for us if we put our foot down.
Thank you. I think that, in that regard, there is no question that the Chinese regime will attempt to pressure us through diplomatic and economic coercion if they feel that will achieve their purposes. So we now have the situation of the hostage diplomacy of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, for example. I suspect that, when Ms. Meng Wanzhou was given authority by the Chinese Communist Party to transit through Canada, the assumption was that Canada would simply ignore our obligations to the United States under the extradition treaty because, there was sufficient knowledge in Ottawa that one should not be detaining Ms. Meng. Now, Chinese diplomats say, well, the fact that you held her means that you must be punished. So even if Ms. Meng is eventually able to return to China, under some means, deferred prosecution agreement or withdraw the extradition request, or a determination by Justice Holmes that the extradition doesn't stand up, we're still going to be punished. The question is, do we respond? And certainly Australia has, I think, over a third of its external trade to China. So the $20 billion of sanctions that China has imposed on Australia, directly connected to 14 different conditions, damages them much more. They want Australia to seek funding the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, for example, that's found out a lot of things about Chinese espionage and influence operations, and to agree to Huawei and to stop their press from reporting negatively. Any number of things that the Chinese regime believes that we can achieve. So I think from that point of view, we have to be prepared for retaliation. And the only reason that this will not happen is if the Chinese recognize that we will not be bowing to this kind of pressure and making concessions to them because they're pressuring us. Right now, holding Kovrig and Spavor, they've managed to stop us from giving any response to Huawei 5G. We're not enacting the Magnitsky Act against Chinese officials complicit in genocide in Xinjiang, and we're not upholding our obligation to the Sino-British Joint Declaration with regard to people in Hong Kong who will be subject to persecution under what we would regard as illegal national security law. So from the Chinese point of view, Canada's response is the one that they want. I think it's the wrong response. I think it's time for us to make it clear to the Chinese regime that we will not be bullied and intimidated. And Australia is certainly setting a very good example for us of the right way to go.
Merci, Monsieur Burton. Je vais aller...
Thank you, Mr. Burton. I have a question for Mr. Mulroney now. Mr. Mulroney, earlier you said that we had to stop working in silos and the departments have to speak to each other. We had quite a surprise a few weeks ago when we learned that in the form for NUGTEC, there were no specifications in terms of security. Now we know that NUGTEC has contracts that can go all the way to 2030, potentially. Is it time to review our processes to make them more effective and more transparent from one department to the next in order to better protect Canada's security?
Yes, absolutely. But I come back to, I guess, my skepticism about the ability of the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, and I'm a former federal bureaucrat, to do this on its own, even with the best will in the world. The government is only capable of that kind of smart, connected operation for a limited period of time on an issue as complex as China. And I mentioned the Manley panel in Afghanistan because it was a recommendation of people like John Manley and Derek Burney and Paul Tellier that government needed to reorganize itself for special challenges. And these challenges needed to be led by the Prime Minister. And I think we would need at least that level of organization around China so that every senior official in the federal government is aware of the fact that if China is involved in whatever issue they're dealing with, they need to stop, they need to think, and they need to consult. And until that happens, I'm afraid that we won't get there. We won't get there by working from the bottom up. This has to come from the top down because it's a significant change in how government operates. And you saw the results of that at your last meeting, where we didn't need to go to Deloitte, to an expensive consulting company, to tell us that government needs to cooperate, but it won't happen without high-level leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Mulroney, and thank you, Ms. Vignola. Mr. Green, you have 6 minutes.
That's actually a great segue because I tend to agree that we don't always have to go to Deloitte to tell us things that we ought to already know. This question through you, Mr. Chair, is to Mr. Manley. I certainly would agree with my members on this committee that this is a fascinating opportunity to hear from people with significant past experience, both in the government side and in the China-Canadian relations and policy side. On November 18th, Public Services and Procurement Canada confirmed that the department intended to stop doing business with NUGTEC, but that based on the standards, rules, and approaches we use, or the legislation, quote, I cannot guarantee or tell you this would be the case. Mr. Manley, in your experience, what Canadian standards or legislation pose barriers to ending Canada's relationship with NUGTEC or other companies it deems to be a security risk?
I'm guessing you mean me. It's Mulroney. Manley's the other guy. And there's another Mulroney too, but I'm the guy you've got today.
It is. My apologies, Mr. Mulroney. It is definitely you.
No problem. I think there are things that come up. We see that officials with justification talking about government procurement regulations within the WTO, and there may be other contracting issues. With respect, this is sometimes the last refuge of the bureaucracy when it doesn't want to do something important. Our national security, as important as the government procurement regulations are in the WTO, regulations which, as Professor Burton has pointed out, China largely ignores, as important as they are for us, and I get that, our national security is more important. So we need to have an understanding within the government that China and dealing with the rise of China is a priority that requires fresh thinking, that we won't accept as the final word, well, there's this national procurement, the government procurement regulation, so we can't do it. We need to think this through and take more time to think it through.
Mr. Mulrooney, just on that particular point, Mr. Johari raised some, I think, what were important questions. You perhaps disagreed, but would it not be, or could it not be the case that Canada's ratification of FIPA and the ensuing 31-year term locking in 7 Canadian governments might be one of these regulations or legislations that the Chinese government could then use to say, under one of their clauses, that we are not in fair dealing with the country in the way, particularly the rhetoric, the red baiting that we hear used, the quote unquote values, compatibility, and all these things that really raise, I think, problematic analysis, quite frankly. Could FIPA not be used in this regard to launch a complaint against Canada's procurement against a Chinese company?
Well, maybe you'll explain later what you mean by red baiting, but because I certainly didn't engage in that.
Not you, but the rhetoric. I'll share with you, Mr. Mulrooney, the rhetoric that we've even heard here today could be considered by many, and in fact is what has been the rhetoric of the House of Commons as of late, is a marked departure from the Chinese government that the Conservatives under Stephen Harper walked hand in hand to for a 31-year FIPA agreement. So as you talk about the long-term policy implications of China, from your professional opinion, what is the material change in terms of the threat? Because I believe in your testimony, Mr. Mulrooney, you had identified that even at that time, they ought to have been considered a threat, and yet the Harper government locked us in for 31 years.
As I said, I think if you look at the Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, it has to do with existing investment and the guarantee that they will be treated according to international law and the laws of the country. So we might, even if we wanted to try to get out of the Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, I don't think it would affect our national security the way that addressing things like government procurement, which means new relationships, new technologies that are coming in, would. So I'm kind of agnostic on that. What I'm saying is that we should be setting aside excuses that don't really stand up to the importance of our national security. And I'm not seeing any willingness to do that. That willingness would have to come from higher levels. And the silence of the government on issues related to China yields exactly the kind of passivity that you saw from officials last week. And that will continue until the government finds the courage to speak to Canadians the way they should.
And in your opinion, in terms of the ascendant power of China as a global actor, how long has that been known that they would potentially take this type of aggressive position? You used, I think, the language about foreign aggression or aggressive policies. So while you were a public servant, was it your opinion at that time that they were also an aggressive actor on the global scale?
Well, I wrote a book about this back in 2015, and I talked about my darkening view of China. I said that I thought that up until about 2009, China was still using the rhetoric of international cooperation and collaboration. With the economic crisis and its success in getting through it, we saw a more assertive China. But that was stepped up radically with the arrival of Xi Jinping. And we have seen China in places around the world, in the South China Sea, in India, interfering in most Western countries in a way that is unprecedented. So this has ramped up in the last 5 years.
Last question, in your opinion, are there any other foreign state actors quite like China positioned to have the same type of aggressive policy that would potentially be a threat to Canadian national security?
There are other threats to our national security, but in my view, and you might want to ask Mr. Elcock about this, but my view, China is far and away the greatest threat.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. We will now go to the second round, starting with Mr. McCauley for 5 minutes.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chair, and witnesses, thank you very much. Mr. Lupresh, in your statement, you talked about the risk from new tech being in our embassies as a moderate risk and manageable. But why would we even bother then, even if it was a small risk or a manageable risk? Why would our government bother instead of just banning it outright?
Well, I think so. That is the overall thrust of the statement, that this is a strategic challenge. But the strategic challenge then also needs to understand that inherently out of the umbrella remarks that have been made about the geostrategic engagement by China flow definite risks. But the problem is we often start, as Professor Carvin pointed out, the conversation on the wrong end. We start focusing on the micro risks that particular technology poses, rather than the broader macro scale and the macro elements, both in terms of strategic policy orientation, as well as how that then is not reflected in adequate procurement practices, in an adequate national security vetting, that would then forego having to have a micro conversation about the threats. But I think, make no mistakes, these are real threats. As Professor Burton pointed out, I mean, any software ultimately needs to be updated. And so the updates in and of themselves pose a significant risk. This is the part that people don't get about Huawei, where people say, well, Huawei says there are no backdoors. Well, there's no backdoors today, but you need to have there's no compromise today, but you need the backdoor built in by definition so you can actually update the software in the actual equipment. And so overnight, the hostile actor can embed malicious technology. And look, there's a lot to be learned. About traffic, for instance, that comes through the embassy, the types of material, when that traffic comes in at unusual hours,
perhaps,
and so forth.
I would think even dissidents coming to our embassy, you would have certainly a second thought before you would pass through Chinese security equipment if you're a Chinese dissident.
And the ability to track how often these dissidents are going, how many of them are coming in and out. So it's a little bit like what signals intelligence agencies do. Just by being able to track the traffic pattern, that in itself can give you a significant amount of information, in particular when that traffic pattern, for instance, doesn't line up with regular business hours. And you can kind of go, well, there's something obviously up at the embassy. Now we should probably leverage some of the other technology or some of the other compromises that we have in the technology within the embassy to understand what that might be.
Great, thank you. Professor Carvin, you talked about a total ban doesn't make sense, but then you segued into all the problems that we're going to have in procurement and other challenges we're going to have to address this. Should we not just then have an outright ban and then start working on addressing some of these many challenges, these cross-departmental challenges, so at least we stop the bleeding immediately and then set up proper procedures?
That's one possibility. My concern would be that we simply would not be able to adjust fast enough. My issue is that we either seem to be all one way and not the other. And what I'm arguing for is layered security. Again, I very much respect the testimony of my other colleagues, but I mean, if we take the example of the x-ray machine and you're saying, well, if I was a dissident, I would worry about going through an x-ray machine. Well, I would be more worried about the street cameras that were certainly surrounding me.
I agree with you 100%, and I'm dumbfounded.
There's so many other ways.
and it goes to your comment about layering. I mean, I was dumbfounded that witness after witness at our first meeting said, "Oh, it's not on our security list. We did the right thing," and it's almost we flew the plane into the mountain, but we checked all the checklist items, so it was a success. Common sense certainly has to have a part of it, but we seem to be lacking because we're more focused on ticking boxes and actually doing the right thing. So should we do an outright ban until we can change our processes, that we don't have department after department turning a blind eye to our security concerns?
In my view, I think it would just be easier to harness the expertise we have now within the communication security establishment. They are perfectly able to provide technological reviews as well as help with risk mitigation strategies. And certainly that seems to have been the case with the CBSA in their testimony on November 18th. They said, yes, we reached out to the CSE and consulted with them when we procured and used these technologies. So I think it would just be easier, would it not, to we have the expertise in place. What I think is lacking is exactly that box that needs to be ticked. Like, we need to completely reevaluate our boxes.
Well, the questions is whether the CSE should do security analysis on them all.
We'll now go to Mr. Weiler for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd also like to thank the witnesses for coming to join our committee today and for the really interesting comments and discourse we've already had. I'd like to ask my first question of Mr. Mulrooney. And given the risk that you highlighted that the PRC poses now and has posed for some time, you mentioned that we need to look at the bigger picture. And I very much agree. And with that in mind, I'm wondering what your opinion is of the 2012 acquisition of Nexen by a Chinese state-owned company. And do you think a national security review should have been done for this $15 billion takeover of a Canadian's natural resources asset?
That, I think, if I recall, what followed in the wake of that was a new policy on acquisitions by state-owned enterprises. But I'm not qualified to talk about I wasn't involved in the Nexen review itself. But we saw an evolution in policy, and certainly that evolution in policy has had to take account since then of the 2017 Intelligence Act in China, which Professor Burton referenced, which basically made every Chinese company an agent in the work of the Chinese Communist Party.
And Mr. Mulroney, with this in mind, how should we look at acquisitions by state-owned companies of Canadian natural resource projects going forward?
I think that the policy that we have that looks at net benefit to Canada and looks at, again, at our national security interests should be sufficient. I also think, and I've said this about foreign investment by many sources. We've seen major multinational financial institutions engaging in wrongdoing. We should be vigilant, and investment locales, notably provinces and municipalities, should also be applying the laws and the rules and regulations that they have in effect. So foreign investment involves all three levels of government. And I think that over time, we're closer, particularly post 2017 and the Chinese Intelligence Act, closer to the scrutiny that we need for SOEs.
Thank you, Mr. Mulroney. And my next question I'd like to ask of Professor Carvin. And you mentioned in your opening that you thought the technical security threat over the provision of the NUCTEC equipment has been overstated. And I was hoping you could let us know what you think the security risk to Canada's consular efforts that this contract to supply X-ray machines would pose.
Thank you. So in the sense that, yeah, I mean, and I think this was backed up by Christian Luprecht's testimony in the sense that the risk is fairly moderate. Of course, these devices do have to be updated, and there is, of course, the fact that perhaps Chinese individuals would be coming in to fix the equipment. All of these are serious risks. But I suppose the point that I was trying to make with that remark is that, just because you ban a technology doesn't mean the threat is gone. And I'm concerned in particular with, say, the 5G discussion, that we talk about banning a technology and we think that's going to make us safer. And it may in some ways, but the fact is all security products have flaws in them. All these vendors have serious issues. Just because they're not Chinese doesn't necessarily mean they're secure. And so we need to be doing these tech reviews on all technology for the reason that we do know that states like China are trying to hack into our embassies and other places. So it's not even, to me, just the Chinese, even though I think that should be for reasons of the problems related to SOEs that have been, I think, well discussed in this particular session. We need the basically all our technologies reviewed consistently and thoroughly, and those clearly that's not something that's in the procurement right now. But yeah, so this is my concern, is that just by focusing on this narrow issue of the X-rays themselves and whether or not they're vulnerable, overlooks the kind of broader issues with regards to malicious actions, say by China against our embassies abroad, against our government, probably as we speak. We're being probably hacked as we speak, but this is the reality. So that was my that's kind of what I meant about that specific technical threat being overstated. It's missing so many of the other broader issues I think that this specific committee could be dealing with regards to kind of broad overarching strategies for procurement.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. We'll go to 2.5 minutes for Ms. Vignola.
Très rapidement.
Very quickly. In 2017, there was a change in the Chinese intelligence law. What was the situation for us before 2017 when that law was adopted and afterwards? That's my first question. I only have 2.5 minutes. Second question. If a company's parent company's in Hong Kong, should it be surveilled as much as a company that is based in Beijing, for example?
Who's the question for?
La question peut aller à Monsieur Burton ou Monsieur Carvin.
The question could be answered by either Ms. Carvin or Mr. Burton.
Mr. Burton?
I mean, I can say a couple of things about this. I think certainly, before the 2017 intelligence law, it was clear that Chinese citizens are always required to respond to the demands of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think the intelligence law simply made explicit something that was already in effect. And with regard to Hong Kong, I mean, Hong Kong is now fully integrated into the mainland system. The companies that operate there would not be able to be independent of Chinese Communist Party control, and therefore I think should be regarded the same as companies from the rest of China. And I would say one other thing. These kinds of procurements are not reciprocal. Chinese government would never put any foreign 5G into their telecommunications, allow any foreign company to install security equipment in their embassies, or allow foreign acquisition of mines and other energy resources. So I think that by itself, aside from the moral issues that Christian brought up, suggests that this is just not something that we should be doing.
Merci.
Thank you. So, if I've understood you, despite the fact that Hong Kong was once a different regime, today it's completely integrated. And let's say that there's a federally chartered company that wants to deal with a Hong Kong-based company that's got a 60-year agreement with a 60-year lease for a condo in Canada. Is this something that that Canada should be putting a stop to?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. It's a question of a Hong Kong company has a lease on property in Canada?
Une entreprise qui désire...
A company that... Go ahead, Mr. Chair.
We're running out of time. Mr. Burton, if maybe we can get a clarification from Ms. Vignola a little bit later, and then you could answer that in writing.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Green, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to take this last section to kind of do what was suggested earlier and get to the root of how we might be able to, as a committee, improve procurement. So through you to Mr. Leprick, how can the federal government improve how security risks are assessed, in your opinion?
Well, first, let's actually have a mechanism to assess that when it comes to procurement. As I pointed out, we do have it when it comes to investment. It is under consideration for critical infrastructure, but it is not currently under consideration for broad swaths of what the federal government does or where the federal government invests, such as research and development. So maybe actually starting by even having a discussion, I think the discussion that you're initiating is, I think, very prescient in that regard.
So in that regard, which federal organizations, if any, should play the key role in the security assessment process? This came up in an earlier meeting, so I won't preempt what my answer is, but I'd love to hear yours.
So we need to have a comprehensive strategy. And this is, I think, Ambassador Maroney alluded to, this sort of continuously working in silos. And one agency, as Professor Carvin points out, reaches out and another entity does not. And so it requires also a complete rethink of how we actually work in government to a much more horizontal from the vertical implementation that we currently have. And I think, as Ambassador Moroni rightly pointed out, there is no good mindset in Ottawa when it comes to policy implementation. The minister loses interest, many of the senior servants lose interest, and they just kind of pass it off to someone. And so I think it requires, in terms of the entire process, from devising a policy to actually executing that policy, it's a 7-step process, getting much more consistent attention at all ways throughout that. That would already be a very good beginning in terms of a more equitable approach.
So in your opinion, based on your professional background, are there any bilateral or multilateral forums through which Canada should be engaging to improve its procurement security assessment?
So the Five Eyes mechanism that I think Professor Carver might have alluded to is already a very good opportunity for us to provide better operational integration. We do this quite well at the defense level, but it is much more recent at the level of intelligence and security, other than signals intelligence. So we are leveraging mechanisms, but the learning curve is relatively steep, in particular with regards to what we can share under what conditions with our partners. And
Right.
so actually putting the frameworks in place so we can actually talk about things in an intelligent fashion with other people who hold other relevant information, put that together to see the whole picture beyond our borders. That would be a good start.
Sounds
Thank
like maybe a course that you can put together and teach.
I'm teaching
you,
it at
Mr. Green.
RMC right now. You're welcome to join and audit the course. Thanks for your fantastic questions.
Mr. Paul Hughes, 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'adresse.
Thank you, Chair. My question is addressed to Mr. Alcock. I am also on the Canada-China Committee, and Minister Champagne testified before the committee 2 weeks ago and said that 2020 China was not the 2015 China, the same as it was in 2015. You can see that NUCTEC is just a drop in the ocean. When it comes to the threat that China poses to our national security, do you think that Canada has already walked away from the fight with China?
Mr. Chairman, no, I don't. I think the reality on this, I would agree with Mr. Mulroney. The reality is the absence of policy decisions at the top makes it more difficult for the government, more broadly writ, to respond to the threat from China. So I think that the importance of a policy, or the revision of a policy on China by the government of Canada, is an enormously important thing. I'm more sanguine than Mr. Mulroney would be about how government would respond were such policy decisions to be taken. But I think that policy decisions ultimately need to be taken.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Alcock. I think today, with the testimony we've heard, it's quite clear that the government has to review its national security practices, and it's urgent, especially when it comes to acquisition and procurement. We know that 2 years ago, the government reviewed C-59 to try to set up better structures, but I think we have an urgent problem when it comes to procurement. So, Mr. Luprecht, I think this question is for you. Do you think we need to do so urgently? We need a more nuanced approach. Right. Not all investment by China constitutes a threat. On the contrary, we're a medium-sized country with a medium-sized economy, so we need some investment. We need foreign investment, and we need a certain degree of technology coming from abroad, because we do not have the ability to manufacture everything here. So having better capacity to identify where that investment can be positive both for China and Canada is possible. And that's also true for the private sector, where the same interactions can take place as in the public domain. There are also threats to national security through the private sector. So we need the proper tools to adopt a much more nuanced approach towards our relationship with China. And the leadership is lacking on the part of ministers and politicians. They're the ones who are giving the public servants and officials directives. The officials are simply following the regulations and rules that are set in place by the leadership. Clearly, the lack of political will and strength is a problem. I remember during the Nortel era, and the Canadian forces took over their building here. They saw that the building had been completely bugged by China. Now, the technology at that time was less sophisticated than it is now. You talked in your opening comments about critical infrastructure. Should we be nervous about China with all the technology that they've already set up across the whole country, could be able to take over control of the Toronto subway, for example? Do you think China would already be able to do that? Answer. The risk does exist because of the ubiquity of their technological installations. But when you talked about Nortel, that was the largest employer in the private sector in Canada, and engineers in the 1970s and 1980s, and that company was a global leader in its area, and then completely failed because of its own mistakes, but also because its intellectual property had been stolen by hostile actors. So, of risks for public transportation, as you mentioned, but also for all kinds of other Canadian companies, because who's going to invest in Canada and who's going to come and do our research and development here, knowing that their intellectual property will be stolen by bad actors?
Now go to Mr. Drouin for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, cher.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues, and thank you for being here with us to testify before our committee. I'm extremely grateful to you. Mr. Luprecht, you spoke about the relationship with Nuntech as being much more like a master and servant. And I imagine you mean that the decision-making process is truly controlled by the masters, of course. But you said it was greater than that. But you said the decisions were made in China, even if they have subsidiaries here in Canada. That it's not that the decisions are not made here in Canada. All decisions are made in China. You're talking about Nuntech, but is that also true? Have you observed that the same holds true for other companies that are owned by the Chinese state? That's a good question. Listen, since 2018,
valuable commodity in the world. Plus de valeur que le.
They have higher value than oil and gas or other natural resources. China's geostrategic approach is to dominate everything when it comes to networks, software, to dominate anything that has to do with data and data flow, data analysis, the ability to capture and control data. Because China knows quite well that the country that can control and dominate data in the 21st century is going to be able to dominate at the global scale. As we've already explained, given the close link between the Chinese government and state-owned enterprises, the Chinese government is able to execute its geostrategic approach with a target, as we've seen during today's discussions, that cannot be compared in any democratic country. Thank you very much for your answer.
Mr. Mulroney, you've often alluded through various testimonies at this committee that we should be cultivating a culture, I guess, of let's be worried about China right now. And you've often evoked that it should start at the leadership, but the fact that China's been stealing IP, the fact that China's been somewhat acting in bad faith when some of our obviously allies and country allies is not new news. So my question to you is, how would you, and then bringing it back to NUCTEC and procurement practices and trying to say, possible thinking of recommendations that our committee needs to make, how would you share that China knowledge within all the bureaucracies, knowing that if you've served in the federal government, we often act in silo, and it's hard to break those silos. So how do you cultivate that leadership inside our federal bureaucracy?
So it has to come clearly and unequivocally from the top, and that is the Prime Minister. It's not even just the Foreign Minister, because there are other dimensions. The fact that we've got this, if you listen to the testimony about the procurement, you'll see that even Global Affairs doesn't have the voice, and for a variety of reasons isn't always listened to. So it has to start from the top. Now, people will say, well, we can't speak about China because of all the things they've done to us, including holding Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. And there's a lot of truth to that, but it's also China's objective. By silencing the government largely, by keeping the government passive, China, I've often said that the people who are affected by this aren't the Chinese. The Chinese are very skilled operators. The people who are affected by the silence of the government are Canadian public servants who continue to pump missions and visits into China, continue to treat procurement as business as usual. And let me, if I may, just add one observation as someone who spent a lot of time in Canadian embassies. The reassurance you got that vendors are supervised inside the embassy is something you should be very skeptical about. I made it my business to travel around and to see what was happening when service was being done. This is seen as a very boring Joe job, and it's often given to, and I mean no offense, to family members, to kids who are returning from university. And when I went through, I saw people, looking at their phones, reading magazines. So all China has to do in this relationship that it would establish through NUTEC is find a few weak links, and believe me, they'll find some.
So would you recommend
thank
that
you, Mr.
all...
Duran.
ran out of time. Thank you.
Yep. Unfortunately, we've time is very tight today, and we've just finished our first hour, and we actually have about 12 minutes left before we have to go into in camera. So what we will do is we will go to the Bloc for 2 minutes, and then the NDP for 2 minutes, and then the Conservatives for 4 minutes, and the Liberals for 4 minutes. Ms. Vignola, you have 2 minutes.
Sorry, thank you. Well, Mr. Burton, I'll come back to my earlier question. Let's say that there's a Canadian port that's dealing with a Hong Kong business that's expanding, and that business would be in charge of automating the port and its operations. And so the business gets a 60-year lease. Is this the kind of investment that Canada should be suspicious of, especially given a port as an entry point, a major entry point to Canada? And how should the country react to that kind of economic opposition?
I'm not aware of the contract you're talking about, but on the face of it, it strikes me as completely nuts to give a Chinese Communist Party subservient company control over critical infrastructure like port facilities. And if we've agreed to such a thing, I think we should review it pronto and stop it.
Merci beaucoup. On s'entend là-dessus.
Thank you very much. We agree on that, especially since this is a port that leads straight to the heart of the continent.
Vous savez,
X-ray machines, Ms. Carvin, may seem harmless. We said that it may be dangerous to have an X-ray machine made in China. set up and updated by the Chinese. If the updates are not done by a Chinese company, is the security threat lessened, or does it amount to the same thing?
Thank you for your question. I'm not saying that it's harmless. I'm just saying what we're dealing with is a spectrum of risks here, and how we manage those risks can have a huge impact on the overall security. And even if we aren't going through Chinese companies, there still are a lot of risks that are put in place, right? So that's effectively what I'm saying. And the other thing is I'm more worried about the janitor than I am the X-ray machine. Because frankly, the janitor is going to have a lot more access than the X-ray machine. So I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. So I mean, look, I think the issue here is not necessarily that this is harmless, or that even if it's a non-Chinese company that's servicing the X-ray machine, it doesn't mean there isn't an insider threat there. I mean, there is absolutely an insider threat. And this is why this kind of overall layered security approach that's looking at these things in steps and trying to, sometimes in critical infrastructure protection, we talk about the Swiss cheese model, which is where you're trying to layer security so you're not, you can't shoot through all the holes all the way through and then eventually hit some kind of vulnerability. That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Garvin. Mr. Green, 2 minutes.
Mr. Mulrooney, in your view, should companies be excluded from open competitions based on their country of origin?
Yes. In the security sector, we should not allow Chinese companies, for example, to compete. I wouldn't let Russian companies compete. So we need to think seriously about where the risk is coming from. And I think Professor Burton talked earlier about this risk or country agnostic view is unrealistic and detrimental to our national security.
And to what extent can the federal government assess these security risks associated with a company by virtue of its country of origin?
By cross-referencing the technology related, and any technology that could make us vulnerable, that could harvest information about Canadians or about our foreign guests coming from a country like China would be off the list. And that's certainly not impossible.
And so, does this would this relate to our national our emergency exemptions, like our security exemptions?
That's why I talked about creating new structures. We might have to look at this in a new way, but we've had 2 years of daily focus on the risks posed by China, and we haven't done it yet. So I think we should get down to figuring out just what that would look like. But the result would be that in many sectors, we would not be procuring Chinese equipment or services for the Canadian government.
And in your mind, this approach, obviously, while trying to honor our obligations under international trade, is something that is manageable, something that we could do based on our current international trade agreements?
Well, that's what I said. You have to look at, you weigh our obligations to the WTO against our obligations to the national security of Canada. That's the first point. Second point is you're going to find that a lot of other countries are in the same boat, and we could be spurring some creative thinking about how we do this collectively, because I could tell you that others are already doing it, and we are laggards in thinking about this.
So perhaps
thank you, Mr. Maroney, and thank you, Mr. Green. 2 minutes goes by very quickly.
It does.
Mr. Macaulay, 4 minutes.
Professor Carbon, who do you think should be doing, before we can set up like an overall rejigging of our procurement process, who do you think should be doing a last person review of any procurement? Would it be CSC or someone else? CSIS?
I think it depends on the issue. I think on the technical expertise, it would certainly be the CSC. I do believe they have that expertise now and have provided it in certain select cases, but they have to be consulted first. Right. And then on the geoeconomic aspects, I think you wouldn't want to involve an agency like CSIS, who could provide perhaps the broader context and would have knowledge of. The other thing about these companies too is even when it looks like it's a private company, that just may be a shell company that's owned by layers and layers and layers of different Chinese companies that ultimately do end up at an SOE as well. And CSIS does have that capability to kind of understand that larger context. So I think, you know, you do need, it's not just one, unfortunately, as I think we've all agreed on this panel. But in the meantime, I would definitely at a bare minimum be talking to CSE and CSIS.
That's something we could do pretty immediate. Obviously, we have a lot of changes we've got to address. To me, it would seem pretty straightforward. We could have saved $250,000. Of course, Deloitte would have been out of pocket $250,000 for a 4-page report. But I could have bought some from CSE at coffee and asked them over coffee, should we buy sensitive security equipment from China? Obviously, answer no. Thanks very much. Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Burton, I have to assume you're familiar with Anne-Marie Brady's paper Magic Weapons. Wondering how you see, are we facing a similar threat in Canada? Or Professor Garvin, you
most definitely are.
What's that?
We most definitely are. And we've been slower to recognize it, but we're facing the same techniques, elite capture, penetration of universities, diaspora communities, media, that's happening in Australia.
Okay. Should we be banning people, groups like the Confucius Institute outright? What steps should we take to stop the magic weapons and all these other programs they're using against us?
I've written, one thing should be, we should copy the Australian foreign influence measures that look at people who are acting on behalf of other states or state-controlled actors, and make it an offense not to disclose who's paying you to say things, who's paying you to do things in this country. And that would be a significant step. But that also involves giving the intelligence community investigative powers and adding criminal sanctions to punish those who are doing this.
How much time, Mr. Chair?
You have 1 minute, 5 seconds.
Great. Is there anything that you see in the Australian version that we wouldn't want to do here? Like, I know the Americans have their Foreign Agents Act that goes back to the 30s. Is the Australian one a better one to copy? Should we take from some of the U.S. one? Are there parts of the Australian ones that goes too far, not far enough?
Well, I think it's still early days with the Australian ones, but we're seeing that it has some bite and some effect. And as Professor Burton has mentioned, it certainly got the attention of the Chinese. But what I think is important is it makes explicit what should be explicit anyway, that if you've had a senior position in government, certainly if you've been a minister, you need to disclose if you're on the payroll of a foreign state and acting on that behalf. And failure to do that should result in criminal sanctions. So I think the Australians have taken tough measures, but they're absolutely the right measures.
Wonderful. Professor Burton, do you want to chime in?
Yes, I think that, the argument that's made on Senator Yuen-Pao Wu's website, which is that Canada does not lead this comparable legislation because we don't have those sorts of issues going on, and that our existing arrangements are already fully able to address problems of retired officials who receive benefits from a foreign state, particularly China, is utter nonsense. I think that what's going on in Australia and New Zealand is almost certainly going on in Canada. And there have been other concerns raised that the Australian legislation might not be compatible with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. What I'd really like to see would be a serious study done of it to see if that is in fact the case. And I don't see why anyone would be objecting to such legislation, because it simply allows transparency, and sunshine is the best disinfectant. And I think we do have a serious problem.
Thank you, Professor Burton.
Needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Professor Burton. I do believe we now have Mr. Kuzmierczuk is our final questioner.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm going to delegate my time to my colleague, Mr. McKinnon.
Certainly, Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kuzmierczuk, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask Mr. Alcock to respond, just because it seems to me we haven't heard a lot from him today. Should Canada just not procure anything from China?
I think, Mr. Chairman, that's probably unrealistic. China is still a trading partner of Canada and is likely to be so into the future. If you were to ask Canadian rapeseed farmers and pork farmers, I suspect they envisage trading with China. Do we need to trade with China a lot more carefully? Yes, we do, But to do that, ultimately, we really need to have a policy with respect to our relationship with China. And I think I would agree with, I think it was David Mulroney who also said this, that we ultimately need to find partners amongst other countries around the world in confronting China. Suggest that we would do it on our own is probably unrealistic.
Let me just stop you there because we only have a very limited time, Mr. Alcock. So, but my question was about procurement specifically, federal government procurement. Should we stop procuring from China?
I think that probably is unrealistic, but again, if you have a policy on what your relationship with China is clearly stated, and you are more careful.
It's nuanced. It's sorry to keep interrupting you, sir, but we don't have a lot of time. So it is nuanced, and so there's a point at which you'd stop not procuring from China.
Yes, exactly right. It is
presumably broom handles and paper clips. That's all fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and if we were to stop procuring, say, below that line, so things we deemed sensitive, what would we expect China's reaction to that be, to say a Canadian technology supplier to China? What would we expect that to be?
They're probably already not going to buy much in the way of technology from Canada. Nortel tried to sell into China without any success. So
that's a 20-year-old example, but
nonetheless true today.
Well, BlackBerry never sold into a 10-year-old example. BlackBerry never sold into China. Shopify doesn't sell into China.
I doubt very much whether they were able to sell very much into China.
Okay. So the point I'm taking from you, though, is that it's probably case by case.
It's case by case, but we also, as David Mulroney said earlier, we need a policy. We need to know what our policy is with respect to China. Once you know what the policy is, many of the other decisions will fall out from that, together with building a relationship with other countries that allows us to confront China much more clearly than we can now.
But how do you devise a policy that is case by case?
No, I didn't say that the policy was case by case. We need to know what our intentions vis-a-vis China are, what we're prepared to accept and what we're not prepared to accept.
Okay, so in terms of procurement, which is the focus of this committee, specifically, if you're the minister who has the authority to execute or not execute on a purchase, what guidance should she take, or he take, in the case of GAC here, from your sort of accumulated wisdom and that of our witnesses? What should we take specifically with respect to your as to your advice for her or for him?
Well, if you're thinking about the present procurement of NUCTEC, the reality is it's a relatively minor thing. You could add to the security review that was done that they should have looked at the technology of the equipment that was being bought, as well as the two security issues they did look at. But apart from that, it's a relatively minor issue. So perhaps that wouldn't in fact change unless the question of whether the Chinese had so dominated the screening industry that became a threat in and of itself. You might continue to want to buy from China if you'd taken all of the security issues into review. But again, it does much of what your procurement policy will be. It doesn't fall out necessarily in detail from what your policy view of China relationships are.
Right.
But once you know what your China policy relationships are, you can start to make clearer decisions about what your procurement rules are going to be. What kind of position are you going to take on Chinese SOEs selling into Canada? What kind of position are you going to take on the level with which you're prepared to see Chinese companies investing in Canada?
So we're putting the cart before the horse in this meeting today. There are 5 hearings scheduled on this NUCTEC issue at the behest of the opposition. Your view is that would be 4 too many, Mr. Alcock?
Thank you. Unfortunately, our 4 minutes are up, and it's a tight schedule today, and I appreciate, and perhaps Mr. Alcock, you can answer Mr. McKinnon in writing. It's greatly
Thank you very much
for that.
Thanks to all of you.
The challenge is that we've got to get this on time, and I appreciate everyone there. So I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here today and your answers to our multiple questions. It's very tough to answer some of these questions in a short time frame, but we do appreciate your comments and appreciate that. So with that said, thank you for being here, and you're welcome to leave. Now, just for the committee members, so that you're aware, we are now ending the public portion of our meeting, and we are going to be going in camera. In order to do that, you need to, the Zoom will end on this, so you will need to go out and come back in on the Zoom attachment that you were given, plus the new code that you were given. So with that, I'll suspend the meeting until we are in camera.